Okay, so we've been going through coal, especially Wyoming and um, Montana coal, and so we talked about how the history of coal and the different types, and then we talked about how it's mined, and then they convey it to the transloading station. So now we're going to talk about the rail part of it, and so now loading the cars. Here they load. This is a standard way. They had a little pet conveyor, like we talked about earlier, little buckets that would bring the coal up and dump it into these bins here. And this is for the steam locomotives, but it's the same process. And then the firemen, they back the steam locomotive underneath. The firemen would bring the chute over, and then open a gate, and then the coal would fall in, and then he'd close the gate. Well, they did the same thing with coal cars. Here's at a mine. They lower this thing, and then the operator would they bring the train underneath, moving very slowly. He would let coal in here, fill the car, and then it would have to stop it. Then it would fill here, and he'd just keep doing that. You can see the different types of coal. They've sorted the types of coal,
Yeah, I
named
was
the
going to ask
size.
about that. Yeah, very
Yeah,
different stuff.
yeah, so this is probably a higher grade coal. It's also smaller pieces. This is big stuff. This is medium sized stuff. So and probably the sulfur content, the BTUs are different constituents. So some of it might be going to metal to make steel. Some of it is for steam for power plants. So you never know. Now we've been talking about the Western coal. Here's a train going out of the transload facility in Wyoming. Um, when we last talked, we were talking about how they mine it, and then they run these various conveyors, and then they go way up to this big transload facility where here they have some storage bins, and then it goes down again, and then up to where the railroad track goes underneath on this. Because Byron had asked, do they ever have covers? Well, sometimes they have to have covers, but for the right now they're just using this kind of a crust. It forms just this very thin crust on top of the coal, and that keeps the dust down because it is
Okay.
friable, and
Yeah.
so it's
Yeah.
some kind of a detergent.
A
It's
surfactant.
surfactant, yeah, that
Yeah,
that
something.
stays on top of the coal, and
Yeah.
so then the train leaves and it's gone. And so this is for what Byron asked last time. This is the mine that goes to the Otter Tail plant in Ortonville, Minnesota, and it gets coal from southwest um, North Dakota, goes all the way across on the Milwaukee Road. This is before the Sioux Line bought them, and then it's very at the east, almost to the border of Minnesota. This big power plant, but it's burning this lignite, which is a low grade coal. It's very dusty. And so when they used the regular coal cars to begin with, and they find they would lose almost 10% going
Oh,
across
gee.
the countryside. So that didn't work. And also the people living near next to the tracks weren't too happy about it either.
Not
So
happy, right?
so they had to put hinged covers on the cars. Normally they don't have to, but so anyway, back to Wyoming. Here's the train leaving, going to Minneapolis, and going across Wyoming, and you see the engines
Yeah.
running up there, and another mine
Yeah.
over here.
Well,
There's mines all over the place there. It's just the whole state is the eastern half of the state. And here's a train coming across Nebraska. Lots of units because these are old branch lines that they upgraded. So they kind of built them lay of land. And so they needed a lot of power.
yeah.
Um, Now, this is a coal train. The Northern Pacific had started doing this, as we talked about in May, or back a few months ago in Montana. They started mining coal because they owned some of the land, so they owned the coal, so they could sell their own coal,
Yeah.
and it was cheaper. And the big thing, of course, as we talked about with the Clean Air Act amendments, it was a fraction of the sulfur, and it was
Ah,
cheaper, and it had low sulfur, so they didn't have to put the utilities didn't have to put scrubbers on. So this is I took this in 1970, late in the year, um, and it's heading downtown St. Paul to the power plant. And this is one of those trains like we were talking about earlier, Craig. They split this train in half, half of it went to the Riverside plant in Minneapolis, and then half of it went to the Highbridge plant in St. Paul. So each plant got 60 cars because they aren't big enough to handle. They couldn't handle 120 cars at once. Yeah. The other thing that's interesting in the picture, these are Northern Pacific U-25Cs, but you see they've been renumbered. The Burlington Northern renumbered everything within a few months of the merger, which is was really a good idea because some of the numbering schemes overlap, and they didn't want the Great Northern 653 running into the Burlington 653 someplace, and if you know, they could very easily had a problem, so they renumbered everything. Now here's another train in Northeast St. Paul. Now this one has 3 engines. This is obviously going down to Chicago. In 1970, the red cars were Great Northern, the black cars were Northern Pacific, and then the Burlingtons had this, of course, the big BN symbol on it. So it was a real mixture of stuff. So here he is in the summertime, heading around the curve down at Dayton's Bluff, and here you can see the renumbered locomotives.
Yeah.
And then the track, it was shocking to see the track. The track is much better now. Back in 1970, the track was horrendous because they were deferring the maintenance. They were having financial problems. All the railroads were. And out on the main line, it wasn't too bad, but they've really improved things a lot. So this is out in western North Dakota. A train of empties going back to Montana with a U-33C and a U-25C on the old NP. These are gondolas with rotary that they rotary dump.
Right.
And this I took this in the 70s. The Milwaukee, they would bring trains in on the Milwaukee, and they would get on the Burlington Northern. They'd get off at, I think it's Forsyth, come across on the Milwaukee, and then they go down to southern Wisconsin. So this train is right on, it's just about to cross the short line bridge over the Mississippi River.
Oh, sure. Okay.
With the ubiquitous SD40.
Yep.
And so we had talked about how in Wyoming, the ownership of that line was the BN and the CNW. And so the CNW had to build a connection, and the UP helped them pay for it because they had branch line up there, but it wasn't a very good, and they had to build connection to the BN line, and of course that made the UP be able to haul coal. So this is in Wyoming, and they in the late 90s they added a third track between North Platte and Gibbon, I believe, is the place where the line splits off down to Kansas City. This is at Grand Island, where they used to have a diamond, and they had guys welding on it all day because they had probably 160, 170 trains going over this diamond every day, in the 2 directions, 2 tracks each way. And so then finally the Burlington Northern said, okay, we're going to build they built a flyover.
Go over the top.
Very gradual grade on both sides, which you can do in Nebraska. You got a lot of land, so you can do that.
Right. Yeah. Uh-huh.
Here's a eastbound in Nebraska, and a westbound in I think that's probably Illinois someplace. This is Rochelle, Illinois, where
definitely Rochelle.
Yeah, the UP crosses the Burlington Northern, now BNSF. Here's a BN train going up the BN line in Wyoming. BN empties going back, and everybody thinks, as you talked about, Craig, one time, Nebraska's flat. Actually, the northwest part is not flat at all. This is coming from Crawford Notch, which is up here this is the south end of the Black Hills, and they have to go up quite a grade to get across the hills here into Wyoming. So here's a coal train coming into Minneapolis, going through heading for Chicago. And this is the view from my fiance's apartment.
Right.
And when we first met, I didn't tell her I was a train nut because I thought she might think I'm crazy. But I kept looking out of the window, and I thought, oh, that's a nice view. So anyway, I was looking out the window, and finally we were over. We met some other people, and this woman says to my now wife, "You mean he didn't tell you?" And so my wife is thinking, "What is he into?" They're into trains.
Yeah,
She goes,
right.
"Oh, okay." So she sits there for a moment, and then she says, if my competition weighs 200 tons, I can live with that." So she's been very supportive.
I like
Anyway,
that picture of the young couple, and she's saying, "Well, now that we're married, you can get rid of all those trains."
yeah.
And he says, "You're starting to sound like my ex-wife." And she says, "I didn't know you were married before." And he said, "I wasn't."
That's good. Oh, that's good. Now unloading the coal, this is how they used to do it. Oh,
Wow.
by hand. Oh, and then they
What do you?
got clamshells. This is they're taking coal from these gondolas and putting it into the
Laker.
collier ship,
Yeah.
and you see they had to have guys down in the cars because they'd have to shovel the coal out of the corners. When I first
Jeez.
started at the power plant, they brought barges of coal in, and they had to have to put a little front end loader down there to get the coal out of the corners. And they had to have guys with shovels. And actually, and so it's needless to say, it's not the most efficient system. But these are clamshells that they'd swing them over here, and then they'd come home and empty the car, and then drop the coal over here.
Wow.
And they still use clamshells. This is they still have a facility up in Duluth like this where they load small loads. They bring it in, bring coal in with a laker with the front unloading boom, and they just unload it here, and then they take a clamshell and load cars by hand. And then they mechanized the ports. They had these systems where here there's a machine that drags the car up here, and then they would literally pick up the whole car and dump it in here, tip it over upside down and dump it into the ship, and then they would send the car down like this, and it would automatically by gravity go back to the yard. And so here's another view. And so they tried to mechanize it, and then they at some of the large plants, especially in the West, they built trestles that were open in the bottom, and they would just dump the coal out. And of course, then they had to have sprays because it's pretty dusty, and some of the plants still go that way. Now in the East, when the first rotary dumpers, I remember being in some of the power plants in the East that had got these. They would bring in one car at a time or two cars, and then they would uncouple them, and then turn this whole thing over and bring it back. Well, then later, they figured out, well, gee, if we spin the thing around the axis of the coupler, and we put a rotary coupler on one end that revolves, and then they have the hoses so that they can go 180 degrees. We can unload the cars without even uncoupling the train. Right. And so here they're doing that. This one's actually outside. Most of them are inside because of the dust. But they spin this whole thing around the axis of the coupler.
Okay.
And so at the big power plants, that's what they do now. And so here's a string of cars going through an unloader. Now inside, the train stops, and the engines don't move the train. There's a big machine in here that grabs the car and moves the whole train, one car at a time. And so here it's loaded, and then the operator tips the whole car. They rotates this thing, dumps the whole car upside down, and then it comes back. And so they can unload a 120 car coal train in about an hour. And so that's how they move, these vast amounts of coal that they have to move. So, and then afterwards they just they have a lot of dust collection and sprays and stuff like that to keep the dust down. So